Hi, this is Dieter with The Verge, and this is the HTC First. That's a heavy-handed name for what this phone is, the first phone with Facebook Home software preloaded out of the box. Facebook integration will actually run on a lot of different phones, but on the First it has deeper integration and more explicit Facebook branding. The First is hard to categorize. On the one hand, it's definitely a mid-range phone, but unlike every other mid-range Android phone, it's not loaded down with a ton of garbage from the manufacturer or the carrier. It's pure stock Android underneath Facebook Home. More importantly, a lot of people have been waiting and hoping for a manufacturer to finally buck this big phone trend on Android, and the First does just that with a 4.3-inch 720p display. So now that HTC has done it, the big question is whether this smaller phone is like so many other smaller Android phones. Will it be underpowered, or will it be good enough for power users? The best answer I can give to that question is probably. It's definitely not as fast or as powerful as the HTC One or the Samsung Galaxy S4. It has a Qualcomm dual-core Snapdragon 400 processor clocked at 1.4 GHz with a gig of RAM and 16 gigs of storage. That means that moving between apps, scrolling, and everything else feels fine unless you compare it directly with the best stuff that's out there right now. It's also not running the latest version of Android 4.2, and HTC hasn't yet said when it will be getting an update. Even though it's not a flagship caliber phone, there's a lot to like about the First. For one thing, the hardware feels really good. It has a polycarbonate shell with a soft touch feel and rounded corners and edges that all just feel natural. If you're familiar with the HTC One X, imagine it had a love affair with the iPhone 3GS, and the First is basically the result of that pairing. So while there's nothing especially premium about the hardware on the First, it's still a step above most other phones at this price point. It doesn't creak or feel cheap at all. The speaker on the bottom is reasonably loud, but it can get muffled in your hand, and call quality and LTE data speeds are both solid. The 4.3-inch 720p LCD screen is especially good, which is something we've actually come to expect from HTC. It has great viewing angles and well-tuned color saturation. There are 3 soft buttons, back, home, and menu, just as there should be, and since there's no S-Voice or blink feed or whatever, everything just works as you'd expect. There's also a LED notification light, but it's inexplicably turned off by default. The camera is only so-so. It's a 5-megapixel shooter that comported itself better than I expected, especially in daylight. There's still a little too much post-processing for my taste, introducing noise and softening some edges that really didn't need it. Low light is also pretty bad by 2013 standards. The camera also sits flush with the back of the phone, so you need to make sure that you wipe the lens clean if you don't want blurry shots. I'm actually kind of stunned that a Facebook phone doesn't have a camera button or a top-level shortcut to the camera. And since this is stock Android underneath Facebook, you're stuck with Android 4.1's camera interface, which I find pretty clunky. But for a $99 phone, this does better than you'd think, even though that's not saying much. I have to say I really like using an Android phone that's roughly 5 inches tall by 2.5 inches wide. You can actually reach the power button on the top, the notification drawer, and everything else with one hand. Battery life in the First was slightly better than I expected. Although I drained fast when I was in areas with poor wireless signal, I had no real issues getting through even a long day with the First. There's no removable battery, so you might run into trouble, but the benefit of having a relatively pokey processor and a smaller screen is that both draw less power, and so your phone simply lasts longer. As for the software, there are a few things to know. Obviously, the first and most important thing is that it's running Facebook Home. We have a full review of Home separately, but I should point out here that it works really well on the First. The overall aesthetic of the First matches up nicely with Facebook's Spartan, chromeless interface, and because Facebook has done so much nerdy coding work, there's not a lot of lag or delay, though it does make you wait a half step from time to time. Home has some interesting new ideas for Android. It merges your lock screen and home screen and gives you persistent little chat heads for your ongoing SMS and Messenger conversations. You can swipe through your news feed, like stuff, and even look at your apps even if you have a PIN code enabled. By default, you enter it after you tap on an app, though you can change that in settings. Facebook Home on the First actually has deeper integration than it will if you install it from the Play Store on another Android phone. Facebook puts your notifications right on the lock screen front and center, and you can swipe them away individually or stack them all together with the long press to get rid of all of them. On the First, you get all of your notifications, not just your Messenger alerts, which is pretty neat. But if you're not a Facebook junkie, the First is interesting on its own merits. You can turn Facebook Home completely off and still use chat heads, or turn them off too for a completely stock experience. There are only 2 pieces of AT&T software on this phone that I can find: visual voicemail and those little bits that make it automatically connect to AT&T Wi-Fi hotspots. Both can be turned off. That means you have a small and completely cruft-free Android experience. It's not as fast as the Nexus 4, and it doesn't have the latest version of Android, but it does have LTE, and for me, those are both trade-offs that might be worth it. So who should buy the HTC First? I think a lot of people, actually. If you want the best Facebook experience you can get on a phone, the First really does live up to that promise, despite the fact that Facebook Home feels a little bit like beta software. If you're looking for stock Android with LTE and don't mind the trade-offs on speed and camera, it's basically a no-brainer. Most of all, if you're looking for an Android phone that you can actually use with one hand, the First deserves a long look. I don't know if I'll be switching to the First, but I do hope that it does well enough to prove to HTC, Samsung, and everybody else that there's a real market for phones that aren't designed for giants and with stock Android. The First is great, but hopefully the second will do away with the compromises everybody seems to make on smaller phones.